Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm going to share my screen. Let's check if this works.
Yeah, it works perfectly.
But can you see the whole presentation?
I can see all your screen.
Okay, let me check if I can do it. Is this working now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
So thank you, Antonio. I'm Ana. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of National Distance Education in Spain. And today I'm going to present what has been my PhD research on migrant solidarity, housing struggles, and no border struggles in Glasgow, the politics of the no evictions network, which I did in the School of Geographical and Earth Science at the University of Glasgow in the UK between 2018 and 2022. In this research work, I explore key debates around migrant politics, borders, and migrant solidarity movement. My background is in political geography, so this is the lens that I'm going to bring to this to my analysis. But it's a pleasure also to be able to share this with experts in social movements studies, because I think this could be a new kind of insight and engagement to my topic. This is basically the outline that I'm going to follow today. I will develop, the classic academic presentation structure. I will start contextualizing my research. I will move on to my research questions, theoretical framework, methodology, and then I will discuss some of the main findings of my research. As I said, my focus is on migrant spaces of solidarities. The main case study of my research is called the No Evictions Network. The No Evictions Network is a solidarity space that emerged in the context of a massive campaign to stop a large-scale eviction of asylum seekers in Glasgow by Serco, a multinational company that held a billionaire public contract to provide accommodation to asylum seekers in Scotland and in other points of the UK. To make yourselves an idea of these struggles, basically in the UK, the housing provision for asylum applicants is completely privatized and outsourced to third companies. And this is basically, these companies are not any company. These are companies that are operating in the global security and military markets like G4S, Serco, and so on. And basically, one of these companies, Serco, which had a billionaire contract to host asylum seekers in Scotland and part of the UK, announced that was going to evict 300 people in Glasgow. In that moment, some of the people affected started a hunger strike in front of the Home Office, and there were a series of demonstrations in support day after day that gave shape to the No Evictions campaign. The No Evictions campaign became a massive movement of solidarity that managed to stop the evictions and also made Serco, this multinational company, lose the contract in Scotland. Since the beginning, the No Evictions campaign was formed by two key groups. On the one hand, the Stop Blockchains Coalition, or ROOF Coalition, which was a group of immigration lawyers, NGOs, and different third sector organizations that were articulated around the humanitarian scene in the city. And then the No Evictions Network, which is the focus of my PhD and which was the activist-led side of the campaign. After managing to stop the evictions, this different group have continued campaigning together and advocating for migrants' rights in the city. And for example, during the pandemic, which was covered also by my fieldwork timing, they launched a campaign to stop the detention of asylum seekers in hotels who had been removed from their private accommodations during the pandemic. Well, as I said, the No Evictions Network, the activist-led side of the campaign, is the focus of my PhD, and the network supports the coming together of migrant struggles and housing struggles in the city. On the one hand, housing struggles were represented by the tenants' union Living Rent, which was pretty strong in the political spaces of the city and had a massive structure of militants across different neighborhoods in the city. And then the migrant collectives were articulated around the Unity Center, which is a safe space that was built in 2006. And it's kind of a space of support of migrant communities, of people in detention. And it has become like a hub of migrant organizing. We have different groups operating there, like Unity, which is a union of sans papiers, the Night Shelter for people who are homeless, MORE, which is an organization campaigning for migrants' right to work and education, Unity Sisters, which is a group of migrant women, and so on and so forth. And these were the collectives that basically came together in the No Evictions Network. In terms of the political geographies of Glasgow, in order to kind of make sense of the solidarities that took place during the campaign, it is important to note that Glasgow is a completely post-industrial city. It was the second city of the empire during the Victorian era. Glasgow has a long trajectory of working class struggles that are part of the historical memories and the political identities associated to place. It has also been quite affected by the Margaret Thatcher's neoliberal policies during the 80s and all the processes of neoliberal restructuration and the industrialization, which also triggered important popular and working class movements of opposition. And today, Glasgow is going through different kind of urban regeneration processes that have completely changed the landscapes, the urban and social landscapes of the city. On the other hand, I foreground there how Glasgow is the biggest dispersal city. What does this mean? Basically, in 1999, the British asylum and immigration law imposed a policy of dispersal whereby asylum applicants in the country were to be housed on a no-choice basis in locations across the country. This means that when asylum seekers apply to asylum, it is the Home Office, it is the state who tells people where they have to live. And this was basically a measure to avoid the concentration of migrant communities in the south of England and clean what was considered a polluted social space. Obviously, is one more measure of racial segregation that adds on a long-term history of racialized exclusion within UK politics. And this is eminently a special measure, right? That means the allocation of these populations to the poorest areas of the country, generally areas that have suffered post-industrialization and deindustrialization and have a large stock of vacant housing that is in very kind of poor conditions. And this was precisely the case of Glasgow. Glasgow became the first city in signing a millionaire contract with the Home Office to host 5,000 asylum seekers in houses that were completely destroyed and in neighborhoods that were completely destroyed. A last thing that is important to note here also is that Scotland and especially Glasgow has a strong nationalist movement. Scottish nationalism is constructed against British exclusionary nationalism, and there is this kind of civic notion of the nation that welcomes different kind of plural ethnic identities, and which is characterized by a pro-immigration discourse. In my thesis, I kind of address how this provides a structure of opportunity for migrant solidarity movements, but on the other hand, this kind of institutional framework also obscures the ways racism also operates in Scotland, and very often for hegemonic political actors like the Scottish National Party, this becomes like a way to divert all migration issues to Westminster and pose independence as the only solution. Well, Glasgow has also a strong history of migrant solidarity since the beginning of the dispersal policy. The areas where the newcomers were arriving were communities with a strong legacy of working class struggles and union struggles and all and so on. And basically, due to the lack of infrastructures that migrant people encountered in these areas when they arrived, different communities started to self-organize service of support, like in matters such as housing, access to health, access to education, and so on and so forth. Also in the different dispersal neighborhoods, there were multiple experiences of anti-raids campaigns and brigades of people watching the neighborhoods and looking at different immigration bans and alerting about the presence of these bans in the neighborhood to avoid the detentions and deportations. And there were also formal campaigns like the Glasgow campaign to welcome refugees, or the Glasgow Girls, who were a group of teenagers that campaigned against the deportation of one of their classmates and managed to win a ban on children deportation in Scotland. In addition to these migrant solidarity struggles, Glasgow is also a reference of housing struggles, with the first massive rent strikes in history in the beginning of the 20th century, and the most recent struggles against the demolition of social housing or against the urban regeneration projects. Overall, these kind of movements and these histories have built a strong fabric and organizing around both questions of housing and migration, which very often in history, especially in the last 20 years, have overlapped, like in this no evictions campaign. Well, moving towards my research questions, in my PhD, I addressed three key questions. On the one hand, I interrogate the relationships between space, borders, and solidarity politics in the no evictions network. Then I wonder what are the spatial politics of the no evictions network, and finally, I interrogate if are no border solidarity spaces borderless, and if not, what are the racialized, gendered, and classed dimensions of the politics of the no evictions network. In my theoretical framework, contributes bringing a Black geographical focus to migrant solidarity struggles, positioning this as part of wider Black and brown counter-cartographies of struggles, and raising key debates around the politics of undoing borders within spaces of migrant solidarity. I am a political geographer, so for me it's very important to draw to outline a conceptualization of space. Sorry, I draw on a multi-scalar conceptualization of space that is inspired on the political geography of authors like Doreen Massey or David Featherstone, and which foregrounds how the relationships between the global and the local are co-constitutive. And this means that the global finds a specific manifestation in its place. Estoy en un seminario, perdón. The global finds a specific manifestation in each place, but also how, like place-based politics have agency in negotiating politics at other scales. This is very important in order to understand how struggles in Glasgow can contest migration politics that operate on a global scale, and also how a multinational giant like Serco can be challenged through place-based politics. Another key concept in my research are borders. I address borders as both material and epistemological devices. This means paying attention not only to the spatialities and physical spaces and practices through which the border is reproduced, not only in the borderline, but through multiple spatial settings, but also to the ways borders operate, structuring subjectivities and social relationships, not only according to these territorial borders, but also to other racialized, gendered, and classed hierarchies of power. From this perspective, I address border struggles as encompassing not only the dismantling of unfair border regimes, but also the undoing of racialized, gendered, and classed relationships that structure our everyday interactions. I focus my analysis of border struggles in the urban space as the everyday space where borders are negotiated. Contemporary border regimes are characterized by a tendency of delocalization and externalizations of borders from the borderline to the everyday spaces where migrants live, and in this turn, cities have become key sites of border control and struggle. And basically the urban border, which has been theorized by multiple literature, encompass not only visible authority practices like down rights in public spaces and so on, but also the involvement of multiple private actors and the civil society in the practices of border monitoring. For example, in the UK, through laws like the right to rent, landlords are compelled to check people migration status before renting a flat. So this is part of the urban management of migration. Nevertheless, I address how the urban is not only a space of control, but also of contestation. Cities spatialize deeply embedded injustices, often triggering the formation of common struggles. Indeed, most of the migrant solidarity movements that we have seen in the last years have been articulated in cities and have a translocal and transglobal, transnational way of action. In engaging with these movements of migrant solidarity, I revisit current literature, bringing insights from work on Black geographies, racial capitalism, and cultural studies. I criticize how migration studies generally fail in engaging with questions of race. And basically putting all the previous literature together has allowed me grasping the post-colonial character of the political geographies of migration, addressing border regimes as respatialization of colonial pasts, and positioning migrant struggles in relation to wider Black and brown trajectories of struggle. Centering race in the analysis of migrant politics means positioning anti-racism as central to the practices of migrant solidarity. Migrant solidarity movements bring a heterogeneity of subjects across different positionalities of race, gender, class, and others. And here I discuss how Black feminist writings on solidarity promote a culture of solidarity beyond borders that situates the practices of undoing borders at the centers of the processes of building the commons. And this literature is also very productive in order to think about how anti-racist struggles, how migrant struggles intersect with other anti-capitalist agendas within these migrant solidarity spaces. In terms of my methodology, I draw on a trajectory on militant research on migration and scholar activism in human geography, which consists basically in producing knowledge with social and political movements. From this perspective, it is understood that academic knowledge can be a vehicle for social and political transformation. I draw on feminist geographers' claim that all knowledge is situated, which entails a constant work on reflexivity around how our positionality and agency shapes the spaces of our research. In this case, in my work with the No Evictions Network, I was a European-wide academic migrant woman, and throughout the thesis, I kind of reflect how this position completely shaped the relationships I built through my research and the findings I discussed through my thesis. Overall, my methodological approach sought to challenge divisions between intellectual and material activist labor that continue to structure current approaches on scholar activism. And my way to contest such divisions was to suggest social reproductive politics as a methodological framework, a research ethics, and as a way of reciprocating. Hence, I got actively involved in the social reproductive work in the network, decentering my academic role and emphasizing the role of social movements as knowledge producers and as epistemological communities. So within this kind of umbrella, the main method of my research was active participation in the network since its formation in August 2018, before I started the PhD, until December 2021. I've done also quite a lot of social media research, looking at the different statements and publications of the network in different social media. I've done also different document research, looking at different news in media, public policies, legal instruments, and I visit the different radical archives across the city to kind of address the histories of these struggles in order to make sense of why this coming together in this moment in Glasgow. And finally, I did also 24 in-depth semi-structured interviews with participants in the network and key informants. This graphic show basically the profile of the people that I interviewed. I don't have time to stop and explain all of them, but basically I tried to cover the heterogeneity of positionalities within the network in terms of origin, status, gender, age, political affiliation, and so on. And basically, I have a good number of migrant voices within the interviews, which I consider important in order to do this kind of research. Moving towards the discussion, I firstly address housing as a border space and a site of racial capitalist reproduction. With the urbanization of borders that I was talking about in the theoretical section, housing has become a key site of border control and monitoring of migrant populations within contemporary border regimes. We find in this situation that the home, which is supposed to be a safe space, turns into a border space and a space of border struggle. Well, the UK has been pioneering in turning this the border space of the home into a niche of capitalist expansion through the outsourcing of institutional accommodation systems into big companies or like Serco or Mears that already had that already were managing similar contracts in the field of immigration detention. In my thesis, I kind of researched these companies and their business, and basically we can see how Serco's profits come from the security and military markets, as I was commenting earlier on. For instance, the company owns 6 prisons in the UK and the 11 deportation centers in Australia. Mears, on the other hand, is a national company, but it emerged in the context of the privatization of public housing as a housing repair company. And it is not too surprising to see how the main shareholders of both companies are global investment funds like the Blackstone group, which are behind housing financialization processes worldwide. Through the privatization of institutional accommodation systems, these companies are becoming border guards in the context of racial capitalism, reproducing what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the premature death of racialized populations. This situation clearly exposed the intersection between the political economies of migration and the search of new niches of capitalist expansion, exploiting racial difference and uneven mobilities. On the other hand, throughout the thesis, I kind of analyze how Serco evictions are, on the other hand, expression of a global housing crisis. In the beginning, this policy of outsourcing was very profitable because there were a lot of empty housing stock in very poor situations in post-industrial areas. But after urban regeneration projects, these companies have seen how their benefits have lowered, and they are trying to find alternative solutions like the evictions or like hotel detention, as Mears did during the pandemic. Well, as I said earlier on, the No Evictions Network suppose the coming together of migrant and housing struggles in the city. These organizations and these collectives had radically different models of organizing. On the one hand, Living Rent Glasgow, which was the tenants' union, was a classic union with a vertical structure and different territorial branches. They worked through different forms of democratic centralism. They drew on impersonal relationships of militancy, and their organization was about efficacy and public political strategy. On the other hand, migrant collectives drew on the no borders movements from the beginning of the century, and they rather adopted the horizontal forms of organization. They drew on consensus-based decisions, and they fostered a model of collective empowerment through practice of skill serving and a kind of militant relationship based on friendship and trust. And very often they kind of sacrifice, political efficacy and formal politics in favor of, questions around social reproduction and care politics. So yeah, we can see here two very different models of political organizing. Nevertheless, throughout the thesis, I address how the achievements and the success of the network in challenging the evictions was precisely the result of the combination of these two models. On the one hand, the tenants' union brought a massive structure with a large number of militants and presence in different areas of the city, knowledge of how to organize in different neighborhoods, and also institutional contacts with media and left-wing political representatives. And on the other hand, Unity and the migrant collectives brought proximity to the communities affected by the evictions, knowledge of the map of Serco's housing, and experience of direct support and self-organized casework with migrant communities over the last years. Overall, the internal map of the network is a kind of sum of these two models. I don't have time to stop in all these kind of working groups. They are not very different from what we have seen in other social movements, but just to put into an evidence on how these two models merge together, we can look at, for example, the neighborhood groups and the response team. The neighborhood groups basically were the first organizing decision of the network. The network mapped all the housing stock of Serco across the city and organize 4 neighborhood groups in those areas where it was known that Serco had accommodation stock. And in these neighbors, the groups started a strong politics of presence. They put stalls in the street, raising awareness and inviting neighbors and people affected by the evictions to join the network. They also visit local shops, community centers, and through this strategy, they reach a huge network of supporters and a lot of people with evictions letters that got involved in the network. And on the other hand, for example, the response team drew on the political cultures of Unity Center and basically provided direct support to those people with evictions letters that got in touch with the network. Nevertheless, the merging or the combination of these two models was also full of tensions and contradictions and internal debates that led Living Rent to step back from the network in September 2019. Firstly, there were important discrepancies in the ways the different groups were framing the struggles. So, for example, for the tenants union, the main claim was housing for all. The main issue was housing, and the political subject of the struggles were all the neighbors of Glasgow, regardless their migration status or their origin. Whereas for migrants and asylum seekers, the key questions were borders and the unfair immigration system. The main claim was amnesty for all, and the main political subjects was embodied by migrant communities and asylum-seeking communities. These discrepancies had important consequences on the decisions that were adopted and forms of organizing. For example, Living Rent was willing to take action against evictions without bearing into account the position of the people affected. So, for example, here we have one of the Living Rent organizers saying how Living Rent was amazing. They stepped to run this campaign and they did it. We organized ordinary tenants across Glasgow and its different neighborhoods to come out and stop the evictions. But we are not necessarily gonna try to work directly with the people in the immigration system. If they wanna come forward and they want to get involved, great, but we won't necessarily work with them. This was very criticized by migrant collectives who claimed that the struggles against evictions should be led by the people directly affected by the evictions. Overall, the power dynamics between these two groups and the different debates led to a situation in which Living Rent's framings of the struggles and action prevailed, showing different kind of structures and hierarchies of power. We can see this in this quote from one of the migrants that was on a hunger strike in front of the Home Office, and says, I always said that Serco was not the big problem. The real problem is the Home Office. The Home Office pays Serco and gives them the right to evict us. This is why I started a hunger strike in front of the Home Office and not Serco. The no evictions campaign is against Serco, but this makes no sense. I have gone to many meetings to explain them this, but they are still behind Serco. Okay, we see here how Living Rent framings and actions are kind of prevailing, showing the limitations of horizontalism as a form of organization, which is always crisscrossed by informal authorities that respond to structures of gender, race, class, knowledge, and so on and so forth. Well, these different framings also got translated in different spatial actions. So, for example, we can see here how migrants demonstrations focused on the home office, whereas living rent actions focused on circles and near headquarters. And well, the politics of the no evictions network overall, its strategies and forms of organizing need to be understood in relation to Glasgow's strong militant particularism. Raymond Williams referred to this concept to address how in certain certain place-based histories and political circumstances shape social movements and the structure of political opportunities. And in this regard, the politics of the network are built upon the legacies of working class struggles and solidarities that I commented earlier on in the contextualization. And on the other, I argue that the pro-immigration stance of the Scottish National Party and the left-wing assumption of Scottish political institutions as progressive shaped a strong institutional orientation throughout the campaign. And this is where I find the key difference between the no evictions network struggles and other examples like the PA in Spain, which were able to kind of combine institutional strategies with more kind of autonomous forms of action. The institutional focus of the no evictions network was evident in the weight that the legal strategy to stop the eviction had throughout the campaign. As I said before, the whole campaign was formed by this group of immigration lawyers and then the no evictions network. So the relationships between this group turned out in a way that the no evictions network was operating as a structure of support to the strategy of the legal strategy of the immigration lawyers. The no evictions networks was reaching people in the neighborhoods and putting them in touch with the immigration lawyers. Overall, the legal case around the evictions, which I don't have time to explain right now, and it's full of legal complexities, was a key structuring element within the whole campaign, and it determined the temporalities and cycles of actions during the whole campaign. For example, one of the activists in the network reflects here in this quote about this fact, right? He said legality became this huge thing, just kind of haunting the whole of the no evictions campaign. I will say we need to wait to see what's the legal way of doing it. We need to wait for lawyers. It became, we were reacting so much to the legal movements in the campaign. There's a pragmatic side to that, like we had to do it, but there's also a part of me that wanted to be like, how can we get out of this? Because we are just stuck on this, and we are just still waiting for the legal judgments. Basically, there was very little space to produce autonomous political imaginaries and alternatives. However, it is important to note that these strategies resulted effective, and Serco lost the public contract in Scotland due to this campaign, and very few asylum seekers were finally evicted. Well, the coming together of migrant and housing struggles in the no evictions network not only entailed the negotiation of different models of collective organizing and political strategy, but also the negotiation of the internal borders, shaping different positionalities of heterogeneity of subjects that came together in a struggle. Migrant solidarity movements are heterogeneous communities formed by people with different positionalities across axes of race, gender, class, and others. And therefore, a key question within this kind of movements is how to articulate a collective political subject without reproducing forms of structural violence and the power hierarchies that these movements aim to overcome. In my thesis, I engaged with this question, drawing on the contributions of literature on Black geographies and Black feminist writings. Going back to the theoretical framework, the struggle against borders encompasses not only the dismantling of unfair border regimes, but also the subjectivities and social relations they produce. A way in which migrant solidarity movements engage with the questions of undoing borders is through the micropolitics of decolonization and the adoption of prefiguration strategies. Prefigurative politics emerge within the context of autonomous geographies and seek to create relationships based and spaces based on the ideal society they aim to achieve. In this case, a society without borders. However, in my thesis, I address how, despite the prefigurative orientation of the network, there was a very important gap between this projection and the real political praxis of the movement and its own internal dynamics. So to show how the network had this approach towards prefiguration and towards creating a space without borders, I have brought this statement that was read at the beginning of every meeting, and which basically tried to raise awareness about questions of privilege, language, and diversity. And throughout the thesis, I kind of address how very often these claims remained on a discursive kind of plane with material practices and quotidian doings in the network, reproducing very often this kind of power dynamics. I also address how this statement promotes decolonization, which is based on the political cultures of British activists that very often are epistemologically very distant to those of the communities with whom we want to organize together. Overall, and continue with this argument, in the thesis, I analyze how, despite the willing of creating an horizontal and prefigurative space, the decision processes and political actions within the network were shaped by power dynamics. On the one hand, I address how the distribution of activist roles and the division of labor followed strong racialized and gender patterns. A clear example of this was the role developed by British white men in the comms group, which was the public face of the network dealing with media and politicians, in how this role contrasted with the social reproductive labor that was mostly assumed by migrant women. I also addressed how language played a key bordering role, often conditioning people's access to the discussion, and how those with native language and activist knowledge usually dominated the discussion, developing a strong and informal authority. So, for example, here Mike says how we probably failed in being too led by people with experience on the asylum and immigration staff, people who had particular kind of knowledge, skills, and connections, and me and at sometimes Liam at others, and this is not accidental. That was people who were white and male. The temporalities of activism were also crucial when studying the movement's power dynamics. I addressed how critical conjunctures were moments where these uneven power dynamics became more and more accentuated, and how, you know, in mediatic moments we had this kind of strong male British participation and leadership, whereas in moments between cycles, it was women and migrants who were sustaining the spaces of the network and who were assuming more leading roles. And basically, these dynamics were not static, of course, and I addressed the negotiation of internal power dynamics as a collective learning process. So we can see this clearly in the shift of power dynamics that took place from the no evictions campaign to the stop the hotel detention campaign, which was actually led by migrants and where the no evictions network operated as a real actual structure of support. We can see this change in power dynamics also visually. The first image is from the no evictions campaign, whereas the second one is from the Stop Hotel Detention campaign. It is the same area of the city, and we can see very different aesthetics, and how in the second demonstration there's a strong leadership by migrant and refugee communities, whereas in the first there's mostly European people. I also discussed how, in relation with many literature on space and politicization, I addressed how the network became a space for the politicization of many migrants that got involved with evictions letters, and I kind of argue this looking at the life stories of many of the migrants that I interviewed. I also addressed how the network built bridges between migrant solidarity movements and other struggles. So, for example, the students' struggles around 2019, and also how the politics of the network contribute to the repoliticization of the asylum debate in Glasgow, which was very dominated by this kind of humanitarian and post-political discourse so far. So from these struggles put again the asylum question in the political agenda. And moving towards the last part of the discussion, which I published recently in a paper of Antipode, I basically addressed here the importance of social reproduction politics within migrant spaces of solidarity. I address how the No Evictions network, beyond the protests, beyond the campaigns, and so on and so forth, became an infrastructure of care and mutual support, where social reproduction politics were central. And looking at the politics of the network, I addressed how social reproduction activities were deeply racialized and gendered, and how they were also constitutive of migrants' capacity, political capacity to struggle. Grasping on this constitutive character of the political, this paper suggests the concept of political reproduction to foreground how within Black and Brown struggles, social reproductive politics not only allow living in the edges of racial capitalism, but also trigger processes of common struggle. I draw on an understanding of social reproduction as those practices towards creating the conditions for living. I move beyond Marxist approaches that focus on the reproduction of the labor force under capitalism to engage with literature on the commons that foreground how social reproductive politics can potentially create relationships that transcend the logics of the market and the state. And I basically argue that this notion of social reproduction is central to Black and Brown political thought and organizing, and to forms of migrant agency. Migrant struggles confronted with the deadly logics of racial capitalism and the borders are overall a struggle for social reproduction. And within Black and Brown politics, social reproductive issues encompass not only material survival, but also epistemological questions like the preservation of Black and Brown cultures or the psychological challenges of living in a culture of white supremacy. Drawing on the experience of the No Evictions network and as an infrastructure of care and mutual support, and linking to wider Black and Brown counter-cartographies of struggles, the concept of political reproduction foregrounds how social reproductive politics are constitutive of migrants' capacity to struggles and are the grounds for the articulation of collective political struggles. For instance, I draw on the practice of the Black Panthers movement in California, where they went to the suburbs with direct actions programs that attempted to support the reproduction of the Black communities in order to create a basis to resist US imperialism and racism. And basically, I kind of engage with how this notion of political reproduction dismantles patriarchal and paternalist divisions between reproductive politics and political action or campaigning. It foregrounds how politics can be sometimes explicit and visible, but very often are less visible and implicit. And basically, it was my conversations during the interviews and informal chats with migrants in the network what made me reach this concept of political reproduction. It was very inspired by some of the militants in the network. So, for example, here, Delis, a Jamaican refugee, tell us how when we come to a space where we are not treated like human beings, a space does everything: the narrative, the structure, the socialization, the consciousness. For me, a crucial part of empowerment is reminding people, yes, you are strong and this is what you have been through. The moment you get that, you don't need to be chasing people to say, come, we are going to campaign, because that's already in people's spirit. We can see how this overcoming of the dichotomy between reproduction and campaigning is pretty clear and evident in the list claim. For her, empowerment meant overcoming the material and psychological impacts of the racist structures that shape migrant geographies of struggles. And the dehumanization she talks about is something also present in post-colonial literature, and authors like Fanon that address how Black subjects are produced as not being. And the first thing towards empowerment is to refuse to keep trapped in blackness. Here, Aisha, another member of the network, says this system is forcing you to kill yourself. I feel that as human beings, we need to support each other, at least not to die. We can maybe have some difference. Maybe we are having difficult times. Maybe we are not able to wear good clothes. Maybe we are not able to eat well. But if we are together, we will not be that mentally dragged that we will die. Again, she is foregrounding the importance of practices of mutual support, and both quotes expose very clearly how racial capitalism, precariousness, and exposition to premature death underlie the multiple experiences of migration. And I want to finish with this last quote again from the list, which I think it's quite powerful, where she says, "It is difficult to say you have to be strong because people have lost their lives because of a system that makes it impossible to live. Therefore, the main question is not how do we challenge the system, but how do we make sure we have a space where people can heal and get revived." It's like being in a battlefield where somebody is unwell, a soldier got injured. They need a place to recuperate, and then you will come with 10 times force or 10 times power. I think this quote basically illustrates what is behind this concept of political reproduction and the importance of breaking these dichotomies between social reproductive labor and political campaigning within migrant solidarity spaces. And well, I'm going to leave it here. Just to conclude, these struggles in Glasgow are quite important in a conjuncture of a global rise of the far right and the tightening of a migration system. Just to give a point, this model of outsourcing of asylum housing is being replicated in different countries in Europe, like Germany or Sweden. And also in Glasgow, the solidarities forged through the No Evictions network have built a fabric of solidarity that has got reactivated very recently in order to contest different downrights and the UK's Home Office policy to deport people to Rwanda. So I hope this research helps in order to build more democratic and equal societies.